There's a particular kind of quiet you get on Route 12 outside Packwood, Washington, in the hour just after sunrise. Mist still sitting low in the valley, log trucks not yet running, nothing but the tick of a cooling engine and the sound of the river somewhere off through the trees. That's the quiet Trooper Dale Whitfield remembers from the morning of September 3rd, 2001. He'd been running radar from a pullout near mile marker 214 for about 40 minutes, watching nothing but empty highway, when he saw movement on the shoulder ahead of him. A man walking, not toward town, away from it. Whitfield eased the cruiser forward and watched him for a moment before turning on the lights. Something told him not to startle him. The man was barefoot on gravel that should have hurt to walk on, wearing a flannel shirt stitched together at one shoulder with what looked like fishing line, and he didn't turn around, not even when the patrol car rolled up beside him at walking speed. "Sir," Whitfield said, window down, "you doing all right this morning?" Nothing. "Sir, can you hear me?" The man stopped walking. He looked at the cruiser like he was trying to place what it was, not just what it meant. Whitfield got out slowly, hands where the man could see them, and asked his name. The man opened his mouth twice before anything came out. "I don't know where I am," he finally said. That was the whole conversation, more or less, until they reached the hospital in Chehalis 40 minutes later. Whitfield would tell investigators afterward that the strangest part wasn't the silence. People in shock go quiet all the time. It was that the man never once asked where he was being taken, never asked why, the way almost anyone else would have. He just watched the trees go by like he already knew what was going to happen to him next, and had made his peace with not being able to stop it. At the hospital, a nurse named Patricia Ostrom got him into a gown and started the kind of exam you run on anyone who comes in unable to say who they are. What she found didn't match confused hiker, which is what the intake sheet had guessed. His left wrist had been broken at some point and had healed slightly crooked. Set by someone without an x-ray, without a proper cast, done well enough that it worked but not well enough that it was ever going to be right again. Same story with his right ankle. Old scarring, consistent with years of manual outdoor labor. Underweight, but not starved. Someone had been feeding him, just not well, and not consistently. He had no wallet, no ID, no scars from a hospital band or a bracelet, nothing with a name on it anywhere on his body. Patricia asked him his name 3 times over the course of the exam, in 3 different gentle ways. On the 3rd try, he answered. "Ryan," he said. Just that. Like he was testing whether the word still worked. If you're new to this channel, welcome to Archive 26. Every case we bring you here is reconstructed as faithfully as the records allow, from search logs, interview transcripts, and the kind of paperwork most people never see. If you find yourself thinking about this one after it's over, that's usually a sign it's worth subscribing for the next one, because we post a new file every week. It was routine procedure, in a case with no ID and a patient unable or unwilling to explain himself, to run prints through the state and federal databases, mostly to rule out that he was a wanted person, or a patient who'd walked off from another facility. A lab technician named Carla Ibarra ran them at 9:47 that morning. She told investigators later that she assumed it was a system error the first time the match came back, because the file the prints matched to belong to a 16-year-old boy reported missing a decade earlier, and the man in the exam room down the hall did not look 16. She ran it again. Same result. She called her supervisor. Her supervisor called the sheriff's department. By 11 that morning, 2 detectives from the Washington State Patrol were standing outside a hospital room in Chehalis, looking at a case file with a photograph of a smiling teenage boy on the cover and a grown man sitting on the other side of the door, who hadn't said more than a dozen words since sunrise. The boy in that photograph was Ryan Keller. He had vanished, along with two friends, Ethan Brooks and Caleb Morris, in these same woods in July of 1991. Ryan Keller was now 26 years old, and for the better part of that first day, the only thing he offered anyone who asked him what had happened to him was one sentence, delivered the same flat way every time. I can't tell you. This case file has been reconstructed from investigative records, search and rescue logs, and testimony patterns representative of real disappearances in the Pacific Northwest. The names, individuals, and events depicted here are entirely fictional, created for entertainment and reflection. This is not a depiction of any real person, family, or case. To understand what that sentence cost him to say and what it was protecting, we have to go back 10 years, to a friendship, and to the last ordinary night 3 boys ever spent together. Randall sat where the highway bent alongside the Cowlitz River. A few hundred people, one grocery store, a Grange Hall, and a lot of driveways that led back into the trees instead of toward each other. It was a mill town losing its mill, slowly, the way towns like that usually lose things. Not all at once, just year over year. A few more families packing up for Tacoma or Yakima, a few more storefronts going dark. Ethan Brooks, Caleb Morris, and Ryan Keller had grown up 2 streets apart from each other, which in a town that size might as well have meant the same house. Ethan was the oldest by a few months, and the one who planned things, usually badly. Caleb was quieter, the kind of kid who noticed when something was wrong before anyone said it out loud. Ryan was the one who laughed easiest and worried least, which is a specific kind of luck to have at 16, and not one that lasts. Diane Brooks, Ethan's mother, still keeps a photograph on her refrigerator from that June, the 3 of them on the porch steps, Caleb mid-laugh at something out of frame, Ryan's arm slung around Ethan's shoulders like it belonged there. She told us that what she remembers most about that summer wasn't any single afternoon. It was the sound of the screen door. You'd hear it bang about 4 times a day, she said. Boys in, boys out, boys in again looking for something to eat. I used to complain about the noise. I would give anything now to hear that door bang one more time. That July, the 3 of them talked their way into an unofficial camping trip. No adults, 1 tent between them, a week's food, and a plan to hike a quiet stretch of the Gifford-Pinchot National Forest before meeting up with a larger group of local kids at a main camp near Council Lake. It was the kind of trip older boys in Randall had been doing for a generation, a rite of passage nobody's parents loved, but nobody stopped either. Ethan's father, Roy Brooks, dropped the 3 of them at the trailhead on the morning of July 17th. He remembers Caleb double-checking the water filter one more time before they set off. The careful kind of kid who liked to be sure of things. He remembers Ryan already halfway up the trail before the others had their packs settled, calling back that they'd see him Sunday. I told them Sunday like it was nothing, Roy said decades later in the only interview he ever gave about that morning. You don't know which goodbyes are the ones that count. Nobody does. That's the whole cruelty of it. The plan was simple. Hike in, spend 1 night alone in a quiet stretch of forest near a decommissioned logging spur the boys had scouted on an earlier trip, then hike out the next afternoon to join the main group at Council Lake before dark. They were seen once more after that by 2 other campers heading the opposite direction on the main trail around 10 the next morning, who said the boys looked in good spirits, joking about something, moving with purpose toward the old spur road rather than back toward the lake. What do you think 3 teenage boys, alone for 1 night in a forest they knew well, could have come across that none of them ever walked away from cleanly? Hold on to that question. We're going to spend the rest of this file trying to answer it. Waiting for them at Council Lake was a fourth boy, Danny Ostrander, 15 at the time, the youngest of the group, and usually the one left behind when the older three went off on their own trips. He'd hiked in a day early with 2 other local kids to help set up the main camp, and he remembers checking the trail every 20 minutes that Thursday afternoon, certain they'd show up joking about being late, the way Ethan always was. By dark, I wasn't worried yet, Danny told us, years later. By the next morning, I was. I kept thinking, they wouldn't do this to me, not show up and not even feel bad about it. That's when I understood something was actually wrong, before any adult said it out loud. I was the one who told the camp counselor. I've never stopped feeling like that made it real. Danny would go on to help coordinate volunteer search teams throughout that August. Too young to be an official searcher, but old enough to run water and radios between grid lines for 2 weeks straight. He never went camping in that section of forest again. He still lives in Randall. He was the first person, other than immediate family, that investigators called in 2001 to ask whether the name Danny Ostrander, the alias Ryan had used at a clinic in Bend years earlier, meant anything to him. They asked me that like it was just a name he'd have pulled out of nowhere, Danny said. It wasn't nowhere. Out of everyone he could have borrowed a name from, he used mine. I think about what that means more than almost anything else in this whole case. Whatever he went through, some part of him was still trying to hold on to that lake, and the 4 of us, and the version of that summer where we all just showed up late. They never reached Council Lake, because so much of what follows is absence, empty camp, empty trail, 10 years of nothing. It's worth slowing down here, on the one night we actually have some account of, even if it's a partial one, reconstructed years later from fragments Ryan was eventually willing to confirm, and from the physical evidence at the site itself. They reached the decommissioned spur late in the afternoon on July 17th. According to the timeline, investigators eventually pieced together and made camp in a clearing about a quarter mile off the old roadbed, close enough to the tree line that the tent was half shadowed by 6 o'clock. Caleb built the fire. It was always Caleb who built the fire, methodical about it, laying the kindling the way his father had taught him. Ethan had brought a deck of cards that never left his pack. Ryan had the disposable camera, a birthday gift from his older cousin, and had used exactly 4 exposures on it by the time they made camp. 1 of the trailhead sign, 2 of each other clowning around, 1 of nothing in particular, a shot of the trees he took just to finish the roll of easy pictures before whatever he planned to save the rest of the film for. What we know of that evening comes from small, indirect places. A partial diary entry Caleb had started keeping that summer, recovered from his bedroom and never fully explaining what he meant by it. The undeveloped exposures on the disposable camera itself, and, much later, the handful of specific details Ryan eventually confirmed rather than described. Caleb's diary entry from 2 nights before the trip mentions, almost in passing, that trucks have been going up the spur again at night. Ryan says he heard one Tuesday. It's the only written trace, from any of the 3 of them, that something on that road had already caught their attention before they ever made camp there. We don't know exactly what time it happened. We know, from where the 3rd and 4th photographs on Ryan's camera were taken, later determined by the angle of the light in the one recoverable frame, that at some point after dark, at least one of the boys walked far enough from camp to have a clear line of sight to the spur road itself. We know the fire had burned down to coals, not been kicked out or doused, which search investigators in 1991 read as evidence the boys left in a hurry, not evidence of a struggle at the camp itself. And we know that whatever happened somewhere between the fire pit and the road, because that's the last place any physical trace of them was ever found. A single reflective observation, because it's hard not to have one here. For 10 years, the working theory in this county was that whatever took these boys took them fast and took them at the tent. It's a theory that gave people something concrete and terrible to grieve. What the evidence actually points to: 3 boys who walked deliberately towards something they'd already noticed before that night, is a harder, stranger story. Not an ambush, a choice. And a choice is a much heavier thing for a parent to carry than an ambush would have been. Roy Brooks reported the boys missing on the evening of July 19th, when they hadn't shown up at Council Lake by the agreed time and hadn't been seen at the trailhead pickup the next morning either. By the following day, what became the largest search and rescue operation Lewis County had run in over a decade was already underway. Deputy Frank Delgado was 29 years old that summer, 3 years into the job, and it was his first missing persons case involving children. He remembers the exact moment the search stopped feeling procedural to him. Day 4, he told us, from his kitchen table in 2001, 10 years and 1 retirement later. We're working a grid off the old spur road and one of the dog handlers calls it in. The dog's got something, sitting down hard the way they do when they've locked onto scent. Everybody stops. You've got 20 people standing dead still in the rain, and for about 90 seconds, I genuinely believed we were about to find these boys. The dog walked us 40 feet and lost it on bare rock. Just gone. That's the day I understood we might not get an ending to this one. Tom Reyna, a family friend who'd worked with Roy Brooks at the mill for 11 years, was one of nearly 200 volunteers who rotated through the search over its first 3 weeks. He remembers the 3rd night most clearly, a night search along the river corridor. Headlamps strung out in a line through standing timber, everyone moving slow enough that a boot in the wrong place wouldn't be missed. You get cold in a way that's different than regular cold, Reyna said. It's 3 a.m. You haven't slept in 2 days, and you're calling 3 names into the dark over and over, and the only thing that answers you back is the river. I still hear it sometimes. Not the boys, the river. That particular sound. He remembers too the morning they found the disposable camera, tucked half under a fallen branch near the cold fire pit. How, for a few minutes, everyone on that stretch of the search believed it might hold the answer. Somebody said, "There's pictures in there. There's going to be pictures of whoever did this." And for about an hour, hope just took over the whole search area. Then somebody from the sheriff's office explained you can't develop film standing in the woods. It has to go to a lab, and even then it might be nothing. I watched that hope drain right back out of people's faces in real time. The camera was logged into evidence, still sealed, and driven to the county lab, where, given no clear reason at the time to believe undeveloped film would hold anything relevant to an active manhunt, it was set aside behind a higher priority forensic work and eventually simply filed. It would sit there for 10 years. The search itself expanded and contracted with the weather and the budget. Helicopters flew grid patterns for the first 10 days before funding for air support ran out. Cadaver dogs worked 11 square miles over 19 days and alerted twice, once on the exposed rock where the boot prints ended, and once, 6 days later, on a game trail 2 miles east that turned out, after 2 days of excavation, to be an old elk carcass. The handler on that second alert was a volunteer named Gail Torres, who'd driven up from Vancouver, Washington, with her cadaver dog Bishop, after hearing about the search on the radio. She remembers the exact weight of that moment. Bishop sitting, alert posture, tail still, the signals she'd trained him to give for human remains. And the 2 days it took a forensic anthropologist to confirm, from a partial jawbone, that what they'd found belonged to an animal. Nobody wanted to be the one to tell the families, she said. I remember standing at the edge of that dig site watching the anthropologist work, praying, actually praying, which I don't normally do, that he'd say human, because at least then it would be over, and then hating myself for wanting that. You're not supposed to want a family's worst fear confirmed. But not knowing has its own particular cruelty, and once you've watched it up close, you understand why searchers sometimes want an ending, even when the ending is terrible. Bishop worked 2 more searches that year before Gail retired him. She kept coming back to Randall on her own time for years afterward, long after the department stopped requesting volunteers, just to walk sections of the old grid on the anniversary. She was still doing it in 2001, the week before Ryan was found, without knowing anything was about to change. By early August, the operation downgraded from active search to person of interest status. By the following spring, it was formally reclassified as a cold case, though Deputy Delgado, promoted to detective by then, kept the file open on his own desk long after department policy would have let him close the drawer on it. "You tell yourself you'll get back to it," he said. "Every year, something new comes in that's more urgent, and this one just sits there, not because nobody cares, because nobody has anything new to work with." It's easy, in a case like this, to compress a decade into a sentence. The years passed, and nothing changed. It's also, we think, a disservice to the people who actually lived those years one at a time. Diane Brooks kept Ethan's bedroom exactly as it was for the first 4 years. Not out of denial. She told us. She was clear about that. But because changing it felt like a decision she wasn't ready to make on her son's behalf. She finally repainted it in 1996, the year Ethan would have turned 21. And she remembers standing in the doorway afterward feeling like she'd done something both necessary and unforgivable. Meg Sutter, a reporter for the Chehalis paper, covered the case from its second week in 1991 through its final developments a decade later. One of the only people, she says, who never fully let the story go cold in the public record, even when there was genuinely nothing new to report. "Every July, I'd write an anniversary piece," she told us. "Every July I'd call the families and ask if there was anything new. And every July for 9 straight years, the answer was no. You start to feel like you're just reopening a wound on a schedule. But the families always told me the same thing, that the worst part wasn't the article. It was the years nobody called at all. The false leads accumulated the way they do in any long unsolved case. A trucker in Idaho reported picking up 3 teenage hitchhikers matching the boys' description in the spring of 1993. The lead consumed 6 weeks of investigative time before the trucker's account fell apart under a basic timeline check. The pickup, if it happened at all, would have placed the boys 900 miles from Randall, only 4 days after the search had already covered that exact stretch of forest with dogs, with no other trace anywhere in between. A hunter near Mount Adams reported skeletal remains in 1996. Forensic examination identified them as elk within a week, but not before both families spent that week believing the case might finally be over. Carol Keller, Ryan's mother, gave one interview in those years, in 1994, and asked afterward that no one contact her again unless there was confirmed news. Meg Sutter honored that request for 7 years. She told us she still thinks about the one thing Carol said in that 1994 interview that never made it into print because it felt too private to run. She said, "I don't pray for him to come home happy anymore. I pray for him to come home able to tell me why he can't be." I didn't understand that sentence in 1994. I think about it differently now. By the late 1990s, all 3 families had, in their own ways, stopped organizing their lives around the phone ringing. Roy Brooks kept working at the mill until it closed in 1998, then took a maintenance job at the county fairgrounds. Frank Delgado retired from the state patrol in 1999, the case file still, technically, unsolved on a shelf. Nobody involved believed by the summer of 2001 that they would ever get an answer. They were about to get one nobody had prepared for. An answer that came back alive and said almost nothing at all. The formal interviews began the day after Ryan's identity was confirmed and continued in some form for the better part of 18 months. Detectives from the Washington State Patrol led the early sessions. The FBI joined within the first week, once the interstate gap in his medical records made clear he'd likely crossed state lines multiple times during the missing decade. A partial transcript from the second interview, conducted 4 days after his return, once he was medically stable enough to sit through a longer session, gives a sense of what investigators were working with. Detective Marisol Page. Ryan, I want to start simple. Do you know what today's date is? Ryan Keller, September 7th, 2001. Page, and you know how long you've been gone? Keller, 10 years, give or take. Page, can you tell me where you've been? Keller, no. Page, not. I don't remember. You said no. Keller, I remember. I can't tell you. Page, Ryan, nobody in this room is here to get you in trouble. We need to know if Ethan and Caleb are alive. That's the only thing that matters to me right now. Long pause, noted in the transcript as lasting approximately 40 seconds. Keller, I know that's what matters to you. Page, is that a no? Keller, I can't tell you. Dr. Alan Voss, the psychiatrist assigned to evaluate Ryan's competency in the weeks that followed, ran a full battery of assessments, memory, orientation, reality testing, mood, and found nothing that fit a clinical picture of amnesia, psychosis, or dissociative disorder severe enough to explain the silence. Ryan tracked dates. He recognized childhood photographs instantly incorrectly. He asked, once, quietly, whether his mother still lived in the same house. What I told the investigating team, Dr. Voss said in a statement later included in the case file, is that they were looking for the wrong kind of explanation. They kept asking whether he was capable of telling them. He was. The question they should have been asking is what it would take to make someone who is fully capable choose silence for this long and hold to it this consistently across dozens of separate interviews without a single slip. In my clinical experience, that kind of durable controlled silence is far more often the signature of prolonged coercion than of any disorder. People who've been under someone else's control for a long time often keep obeying the last instruction they were given long after the person who gave it is out of the picture, sometimes for years. It's not defiance. It's a kind of conditioning that doesn't switch off just because the danger technically has. While psychiatric evaluation ran its course, a second team worked the more mechanical side of the case, reconstructing where Ryan had physically been for 10 years, using medical and employment records rather than his own account. It was slow, unglamorous work, pulling clinic intake forms, temp agency payroll records, and shelter logs from 5 states, cross-referencing physical descriptions and the specific distinctive fracture pattern in his left wrist. What they found was a decade with no fixed address and no fixed name. A 1994 clinic visit in Bend, Oregon, under the name Danny Ostrander, treating a laceration. A 1996 payroll entry for a temporary logging crew near Sandpoint, Idaho, listing a R. Kessler, same birth year, same build. A 1999 intake form at a shelter in Kalispell, Montana, under no name at all, just an intake number, describing a man in his early 20s who stayed 4 nights and left without collecting a single meal voucher he was owed. In every record, he never stayed anywhere long enough for anyone to really know him. Detective Page told us later that the pattern read less like a man in hiding and more like a man being moved. Someone who never got to choose when he left a place, only that he had to. Meg Sutter, still covering the story a decade in, remembers the press conference where Ryan's return was announced, and remembers the specific frustration in the room when the department confirmed he wasn't yet speaking about where he'd been. There was a reporter next to me who said under his breath, "What is he protecting?" And I remember thinking, nobody in this room has asked what's protecting him. That's the version of the question that actually matters. The case's second life began, unglamorously, with a routine records audit. In early 2001, several months before Ryan was found, as it happens, the Lewis County Sheriff's Office was digitizing decades of cold case evidence logs ahead of a new record system going live. It was during that audit that a clerk flagged an item that had technically remained in evidence for 10 years without ever being processed. One sealed disposable camera, recovered July 20th, 1991, from the Brooks Morris Keller search site. Film never developed. Detective Frank Delgado, retired by then, but still consulting part-time on unresolved cases from his old department, was the one who pushed to have it sent to a private forensic imaging lab in Seattle, rather than simply logged and reshelved. "I'd carried that case for 10 years without a single new piece of evidence," he said. "I wasn't about to let an unopened roll of film sit for an 11th. The film had degraded badly. A decade in a humid evidence locker does that. And of the roughly 24 exposures, the lab was only able to recover one frame with any usable detail. A partial off-center shot of an old pickup truck parked on what technicians later confirmed, by matching background terrain, was the decommissioned spur road near the boys' camp. In 1991, even developed, the image would likely have told investigators very little. A truck on a logging road wasn't inherently suspicious in a working timber county. In 2001, with the digital enhancement tools that hadn't existed a decade earlier, lab technician Priya Anand was able to isolate and sharpen 3 specific details from that single frame. A faded sticker for a sawmill, Corliss Brothers Lumber, that had closed its doors in 1994. A partial commercial license plate, legible enough to narrow a registration search. And in the truck bed, a specialized hydraulic loading arm of a type used, at that time, by only a small number of independent logging outfits in the region. Most of them contracted or subcontracted work, rather than operating under the major timber company's own names. Cross-referenced against county fuel purchase records from that summer. Decommissioned road access logs. Technically restricted, meaning any legitimate presence on that road would have needed a permit. And payroll filings from timber companies that had since gone out of business. Investigators narrowed the truck's likely operator to a small, unlicensed logging crew that had, according to several later witness accounts, been harvesting timber illegally inside protected sections of the National Forest through the late 1980s and into the early 90s, cutting outside their permitted boundaries and selling the wood off the books to avoid both taxation and inspection. 2 former members of that crew, tracked down separately and interviewed without knowledge of what the other had said, independently placed teenage boys near the illegal cutting site during that same window in July 1991, though neither, at the time of their initial interviews, was willing to say more than that. One of them, a man who agreed to speak with investigators only on condition that his name not be used publicly, described the moment more plainly in a later formal statement. "We weren't supposed to be up that spur that summer. Everybody on the crew knew that. When those boys came out of the trees that night, it wasn't like seeing hikers. It was like everybody on site understood, all at once, without anybody saying it, that something had just gone wrong that couldn't be undone by asking them nicely to forget what they saw. It was only after investigators laid this specific corroborated evidence in front of Ryan, not asking him to explain the whole decade, only to confirm or deny what they had already independently established, that he was willing to say anything at all. He didn't describe the 10 years. He confirmed one fact and offered one sentence about the night itself that investigators hadn't yet pieced together on their own. "We saw something we weren't supposed to see, and then somebody saw us." That sentence, and the documentary trail behind it, changed the shape of the case for good. Investigators no longer needed Ryan's testimony to carry the weight of it. They built the case around him instead, using him only to confirm what the paper trail had already begun to prove. Old ledgers and tax filings recovered from the defunct logging outfit's bankruptcy records, combined with the fuel logs and independent witness statements, established a documented pattern. The crew had a history of intimidating anyone who stumbled onto their unpermitted cutting sites, and, in one prior instance, uncovered by investigators combing county court records from 1988, had been implicated, though never charged, in the disappearance of a forest ranger who'd reported unauthorized activity on that same stretch of decommissioned road 3 years before the boys ever set foot on it. In 2002, 3 former members of the logging crew were charged with evidence tampering and obstruction of justice. 2 others, former crew members who came forward voluntarily once enough time and legal pressure had passed that they were willing to trade testimony for reduced exposure, were charged with involuntary manslaughter in connection with the deaths of Ethan Brooks and Caleb Morris, a charge built on witness testimony, the documented pattern of prior intimidation, and circumstantial physical evidence, since neither boy's remains were ever recovered. Deputy District Attorney Louise Farr, who prosecuted the case, told local reporters at the time that it was one of the hardest cases she'd ever built, proving a death without a body, a decade after the fact, largely on the corroborated word of men who had every reason to shade the truth in their own favor. "What made it work," she said, "wasn't any one piece of evidence. It was that every piece, the photograph, the fuel logs, the independent witness statements, even the pattern of Ryan's medical records across 5 states, told the same story from a different angle. None of it depended on trusting any single person completely. That's usually what it takes in a case this old." Diane Brooks attended every day of the 2003 sentencing hearing, seated in the same row each morning, a folder of Ethan's school photographs on her lap that she never once opened in front of the courtroom. She told Meg Sutter afterward that she'd gone in expecting to feel something like relief when the sentences were read, and instead felt something closer to exhaustion, the specific, bone-deep tiredness of finally setting down a weight she'd been carrying so long she'd forgotten what it felt like to walk without it. "Somebody behind me said, 'Justice,' when the verdict came down," she said. "I understood why they said it. I just couldn't make the word fit what I was feeling. Justice sounds like an ending. This just felt like the weight changing shape." Ryan did not attend the sentencing. He sent no statement. Frank Delgado, retired and no longer officially connected to the case, drove up from his home outside Chehalis to sit in the back row anyway. The same man who'd stood in the rain in 1991, watching a search dog lose the scent on Bear Rock, closing out in that one quiet hour, the longest case of his career. "I didn't need to be there for the department," he said. "I needed to be there for the 29-year-old version of myself who stood on that rock in the rain and didn't know if he'd ever get an answer. Somebody had to tell him it finally came." Ryan was never treated as a suspect. The pattern across his 10 years, the injuries treated without proper care, the constant movement, the absence of any record showing he'd ever held a job, a residence, or an identity for longer than a few months at a stretch, was, in the words of the lead investigator, the profile of someone who spent a decade being relocated by people with something to hide, not someone hiding on his own account. Investigators came to believe, based on the documented pattern and on the limited corroboration Ryan eventually offered, that he had been kept moving deliberately, passed along a loose, informal network connected to the logging operation's remaining members, under an understood threat that going home or speaking would put his family at risk. When the operation's core members scattered and stopped operating together in the late 1990s, the informal network keeping track of him seems to have simply thinned out until, in the summer of 2001, nobody was watching closely enough to notice when he finally walked away from a temporary work site in eastern Washington and didn't come back. He has never given his own parents the full decade either. Carol Keller told Meg Sutter, in the one interview she gave after Ryan's return, that she stopped asking for the whole story 2 years in. "I used to think I needed every detail to forgive whatever happened," she said. "What I actually needed was just him, across the table, eating dinner. I got that back. I've made my peace with not getting the rest." In a brief statement given to investigators in 2005, when the case was formally closed pending any further evidence, Ryan offered the only explanation he has ever repeated on record, then or since, the same sentence, almost word for word, that he first gave detectives 4 years earlier. Some people should never find out what was in that forest. The case remains listed among the region's most significant unsolved disappearances, not because no one was ever held accountable, but because the full truth of what happened to Ethan Brooks and Caleb Morris on that spur road in July of 1991 never fully surfaced, and at this point, most likely never will. Diane Brooks still keeps that photograph on her refrigerator. Roy Brooks still lives in the same house, in case, he says, either boy ever needed to know exactly where to find it. Frank Delgado keeps a copy of the file at home, even now, though he's the first to say he no longer expects to open it again. "We want to thank you for spending this much time inside this case with us. Cases like this one don't resolve the way a story usually does. There's no clean ending, no full accounting, just a decade of silence, and one man who came back carrying most of it alone. If it left you with your own theory about what really happened on that spur road, or what you think Ryan is still protecting, we'd like to hear it in the comments. This is exactly the kind of case where different people notice different things. If this reconstruction was worth your time, a like helps more people find it. And if investigative cases like this one are something you want more of, we'd be glad to have you subscribe for the next file from the archive. This has been a fictional narrative inspired by the kinds of real human situations investigators encounter in long-term missing persons cases, created for entertainment and reflection. No real individuals, families, or events are depicted. Archive 26 will return next week with another case file.